UX Podcast Episode 293.
So, hello everybody and welcome to UX Podcast, coming to you from Stockholm, Sweden. We are your hosts, Per Axbom
and James Roy Lawson,
balancing business, technology, people, and society with listeners all over the world. And joining us today is Katie Swindler, and Katie is a user experience strategist, originally educated as a theater director. And I had to look that up, of course, and a theater director is responsible for ensuring the quality and completeness of theater production and for leading the members of the creative team into realizing their artistic vision for it. So I love how people within the design profession often have this deep well of other perspectives to draw from.
So Katie published the book Life and Deaf Design, What Life-Saving Technology Can Teach Everyday Designers with Rosenfeld Media. It was earlier this year, wasn't it? It's another pandemic product, but this time also very aligned with the emotional distress that many of us have experienced over the past 2 years. The book focuses on designing for people under significant stress, which, as we shall see, can happen in many different circumstances.
I feel like kind of a method actor today because I've been messaging James all day, telling him how stressed I am. And so between meetings and holding workshops and stuff, and so I'm ending the day with interviewing a person who can teach me about how to design for stressful situations. And I've been thinking all day about how it's affected my driving and my decision making and my intuition. Can you tell us a bit more about who is the book for and what types of life and death situations are we talking about?
Sure. So the subtitle of the book I chose was What Life-Saving Technology Can Teach Everyday Designers, because, as you mentioned, pretty much any human user that you're designing for might be stressed, right? So I look in the book at a lot of high stakes, high stress industries that study the intersection between stress and design. But one of the things when I was researching that I found was the things that they discover in those research for those high stakes industries, they're applicable across all industries. So things that, I was reading and learning about designing for aviation and healthcare and the military, I could see broader implications for applying those to, other sorts of high stress, high stakes jobs, things like that might not be life and death, like, like a day trader or a customer service rep, but it's still a very high stress job, or, designing for stressful moments for a consumer. Like maybe you have a whole app and you have one feature that's meant to be used like after a car crash, right? To order a tow truck or something. Or, maybe your product shouldn't really be stressful at all, but people, like you said, they're having a hard day. They're in the midst of a pandemic, or, they've read the news headlines in any of the last 3 years, they're coming in a stressed out state of mind to the product, and all of that makes it more difficult for them to use your product. And so I think it's essential for any designer of any product that's used by humans to understand the human stress response and the sort of impacts it has on behavior and understanding and people's ability to use and learn the products, because it can affect the design choices that we make.
And I do appreciate how you start us off with thinking about all these high stress situations and these professions. And then as you read along, you sort of realize, well, this is everyday life. Yes. It applies to basically everyone. So it's really about helping people solve problems. And you don't know if people are in a stressful situation. You have several examples, and you even mentioned the car crash. Now, I was almost in a car crash the other day. And that, of course, it wasn't about me calling afterwards because it wasn't that bad. But everything after that, no matter what I was doing, was affected by that, of course, experience. So you don't know where people are coming from, which means that it really applies to all the designs you're making.
That's exactly right. And, I use this information as a designer, obviously, but I also use it as a mom or as a manager or as a neighbor trying to help get people in my neighborhood to work together. Like you use once you know these fundamentals about the stress response and how it affects human behavior, at least I find myself using it all of the time to help, just make my life better and to manage my own stress. Because this is, it's been a very stressful period in all of our lives. And it was a really unique experience writing a book about stress during the pandemic. I hadn't intended to do that. I actually signed my contract the January 2020. So,
really?
Yeah. And so I had signed to write this book. It was just a topic of interest to me. And then I signed the contract January 2020, and I was supposed to start writing on March 15th, 2020. That was,
right.
Yeah, that was the
wow.
day I learned that my daughter's school was going to be closed, supposedly for 2 weeks,
Yeah.
right? But that was supposed to be the first day I was sitting down to write this book. So the one thing that I learned in my research is our memories and the way that we form memories is affected by stress. And even though we learn and retain a lot about sort of the things that are we perceive as dangerous, like those markers get embedded very deeply, but the way that we feel and the way that our brain, the way our mind works in those moments is actually really hard to recall after the fact. It's also really hard for us to predict how we will behave in a stressful situations. There's studies that say, women, what would you do if you were in an interview and a man makes a pass at you? And they'd say, I would slap him in the face, or I would walk out, or I would do this or do that. But when you actually look at people's behavior in those moments, oftentimes they react entirely differently. The most common thing is they just get through it. They are quiet and they get out of the situation as quickly as possible. It's just really hard for humans to predict our own behavior when we are in a state of stress different than now. So, and to remember what it was like after the fact,
Right.
And so writing the book while I was in this heightened state of mind and going through this research and relating it to my time in that moment, I think it really helped unlock as much as I could get out of that research, kind of experiencing it personally in that moment. So even though it was a very difficult time to do something like write a book, because I'm not Shakespeare and this isn't King Lear, which he wrote during the pandemic lockdown. It was, in some ways it probably, this book is as best as it could be because of the exposure that I had to those heightened stress states while I was going through the research process.
Let's walk through, the steps within the stress response, because I think that being able to refer to those steps will help us in conversations about the different pieces of the puzzle, because there are different ways that people, of course, can be stressed, and for how long that impacts how they feel, how it impacts their behavior, and in what situations that can appear. And I like this startle, just the thing of being startled is that you realize that, people can be startled in so many different ways. Yes,
exactly. I break down the stress response into 5 states. So the first, of course, being the startle response, as you mentioned. And that's a very instantaneous, we're talking milliseconds, reaction to an unexpected possible threat. From the startle response, there's some things that happen. First, we have what I call the intuitive assessment. That is, yes, we see something flying towards our face, but is that actually a danger or not? We jerk out of the way. That's the startle response. But then when our body is deciding, do we go into fight or flight or not? That's the intuitive assessment, and it's all based on categorization and just matching to things that we, our lived experiences. So that intuitive assessment is step 2. 3 is if sometimes the the response stops there. The intuitive assessment says, oh, that's not a real danger, don't worry about it. But if it says it is a real danger, then you go on to step 3, which is fight, flight, or freeze. That, I think, is what most people are most familiar with in terms of the stress response. That's when the, cortisol gets dumped, the adrenaline gets dumped, and you can, quickly get to sort of panicked style behaviors. Though it doesn't always go to that extreme, right? Like people can just get, feisty, right? Like, or people often are just, flight response, especially like on a website, flight response can just be Xing out, like, ooh, this website seems dangerous. Ooh, I don't want to be here. I think I'm going to get, hacked, right? So, or I'm going to get a virus, right? Like they just X out. So, fight, flight, or freeze. Freeze being like, I'm going to take no action, like I can't make a decision. I'm overwhelmed by, decision paralysis, right? Like that's sort of the lower level version of the freeze response. So the way we get past the fight, flight, or freeze response is when our prefrontal cortex, our logic and reason kick in. And that, is then we get this reasoned reaction, which is step 4, where we say, oh, I can deal with this. Using these tools that I have as a human, and so, that's often that I think the most activity within a digital space happens actually with that reasoned reaction. We are helping people not panic, not live in step 3, but actually get to step 4, take action, solve a problem, call the tow truck, get an Uber, you know what I mean? Like that's step 4. And that's actually when a big flurry of activity is happening in a digital space. And then also in step 5, that recovery phase where, the moment of crisis has passed, but there is still things that you need to do. And there are things that designers can do to sort of help speed that recovery process. Barry, you were saying, you were in a near car crash and that affected your behavior for a long time afterwards. So there's, we get adrenaline and cortisol. I mean, we call it a shot of adrenaline, and that is dumped in milliseconds into our bloodstream. But just like if we'd taken a shot of alcohol, it's actually our liver and kidneys that have to filter out those neurochemicals. So it's a much longer process that it takes in order to get that out. And our behavior and our thought processes are affected during that entire recovery period. It's anywhere from like 20 minutes, and it can be hours, days if you're in like a dangerous wartime situation, right? Like where you're in this like constant danger. Usually we're talking about an acute event that happens and ends, it's usually like about 2 hours afterwards where the cortisol gets completely out of your system. The adrenaline gets out a little bit faster, and then the cortisol follows a couple hours after. So
I realize it's helping me to understand my own behavior. Just like you were saying before, it's helping me to understand, well, I probably did that because this was happening within my body. It's so valuable to actually understand that process. But of course, then also as a designer, as you were speaking, I was thinking even of micro interactions. Every design is about people getting stressed about not knowing what do I do now? What will happen? So there's this tiny stress that goes on, and then you find it, and then you get this information telling you that you did the right thing, or you ended up in the right place, and you relax, and that's the recovery phase. So it's like I was thinking, you can bring it big or small. And if you have all those small, tiny micro interactions, and a lot of them are getting you stressed, I guess that just adds and adds and adds until you get really aggressive and angry.
Yes, exactly. And I think people often, you're talking about micro interactions, like the fight or flight response happens all of the time, and it's very intuition based. We talk all the time about intuitive design, but we don't often talk a lot as designers about intuition, right? Like, and developing intuition and what makes, people's spidey sense tingle, right? But people develop intuition around how websites should work. And when your website violates those expectations, if the branding doesn't look quite right, or if the accordions don't open and close, or they click on a button expecting to go one place and they get taken to a completely different website, right? Like when those expectations are violated, that triggers our intuitive sense of danger. Like, we are programmed as humans, and the ones who survived millions of years of evolution, right, to get where we are, because we pay attention to things and we treat things that are unexpected as dangerous. And so by understanding that violating these expectations is really going to trigger people's stress responses, I think it helps us make better choices as designers, and helps us understand when people are going to leave, when people are going to get angry, right? Like, oh, this didn't work how I expected, and now I'm mad about it. Or they just, more often than not, they just get out, that you're triggering that flight response. And as you said, like, it's at different levels. They're not in a panic because the branding is off on your payments page. They're not like fleeing the room or throwing their computer across, but they are. It's scale. The response is the same. It's just scaled to the situation, because at the end of the day, we're fairly simple creatures driven by the same set of neurochemicals.
This is really interesting though, about the expectations, because I mean you see how, I mean, when you've got more general products or to more general audience, then my experience would say that the evenness of their expectations or existing knowledge about interfaces or what's possible really does vary. And then when you work with like an enterprise product and you're dealing with an interface that someone's going to be using for like 40 hours a week, their expertise in the interface or related interfaces becomes so exact. And if you vary from what's an industry standard maybe for that branch, you can end up causing all kinds of problems. So that's a fascinating thing to think about. Like, how do you assess and understand people's intuition or existing knowledge about things?
Yeah, the interesting thing is, in this space, is actually the tactics that you take to design for consumers in stressful situations versus experts in stressful situations they have trained for is very different. I actually just taught a workshop a few weeks ago, and like the whole first half was dedicated to designing for stressed out consumers, and the second half was about designing for experts in high stress situations, because the thing that differentiates the novice from the expert is experience, and it is experience and repetition and training that develops somebody's intuition. And so when somebody has developed that reliable intuition, they have moved a lot of the processes that they are doing from from something they have to think about, and it takes a lot of time, to something that's automatic, right? They can actually they can't do the hardest parts of their job, the parts that they really need their expertise for, if they are thinking about all of the things that they have made automatic. The reason they're able to get to the depth of expertise in their particular area is because they've automated a lot of the pre-steps before it, so they can put their cognitive effort, their brain power, towards that most difficult end of the scale. And that's what separates them from novices in the space. And if you interrupt that first part, the part that they have automated, that is a really terrible thing, and you're going to undercut the expert, right? Like, you're taking away what makes them the expert by making them think about the part of it that they have gotten automated through repetition and practice. Like, if there's great studies around taking novice golfers and expert golfers, and if you give them try to have them make their putt shot, and you give each group a task, like, oh, you have to make it timed, right? Like, you have to do it fast. The novices get worse when they have to do it fast. The experts get better when they have to do it fast, because they are falling back on training and expert and intuition, and it just goes. Same with if you try to have them do like math while they're taking it, right? Or versus thinking really hard about their shot. If you actually make an expert think really hard about their shot, they get worse, whereas the novices get better. And then if you distract them, we call it sometimes, have you guys heard the phrase, get out of your head? Like the actors use it all the time. Like, and I think sports people use it, you got to get out of your head because and so if as designers, if we are working on a tool that is meant for a professional to use, like we need to be thinking about how do we design that tool in a way that helps them, get out of their head, that they are not having to think about the nitty gritty. They are focused on the thought work, on the hard work, on the problem solving that they need to be paying attention to. I think that, when we think about, things that are kind of cornerstones of our industry, things like test and learn, right? Like we have to be really thoughtful about test and learn, especially when we're going to expert users, because, somebody was telling me, from, a colleague at Allstate, they were watching some of the, customer service representatives in our company use their interface, like their software, their customer service software. And they noticed that as somebody's going through all of these screens, they're actually moving their mouse to where the next button they're going to need to click will be before the screen has even loaded, right? Like it's all muscle memory. And so if you are trying to improve that flow, and you switch what that button does, you switch the placement of the button, or you switch around what the buttons do, it's going to be very difficult to be, to circumvent those habits. And we know that even if the first couple times they use it and they're thinking really hard about it and they can do it, they're going to constantly fall back. As soon as they start to gain competency in the new area, they're going to go into, unconscious competence type things. And they're going to fall back on old habits. Right. So it's very difficult to make small changes within a familiar environment that they have had a lot of practice in. It's almost better when redesigning things to just do a hugely fresh redesign where all you're dealing with is somebody learning the new learning curve, and not a learning curve plus fighting remaking old habits, right? So
I love that perspective because that's completely opposite to what you hear other people say, is that you design incrementally and improve incrementally.
And it's because so much of the rules of our trade are focused on designing for consumer audiences, right? Like, because that's where a lot of the money is, I guess. I don't know, or at least that's the stuff that is more shared in our industry. Usually, if you're designing something for a professional audience, there's a lot of intellectual property and protection and like NDAs, and like we don't talk about that stuff because it's a secret sauce for the company, right? And so we're not as open as opposed to designers who design for a consumer space. Like, you can, go click to it and you can look at it and it's all public, and, it's very easy for designers to build their portfolios if they work primarily on the consumer side. And it can be really difficult for designers who are designing primarily on the professional side because a lot of that stuff is secret. But it also affects the sort of standards that we have and best practices that are shared throughout our industry. Not as many of those best practices are shared amongst designers for professional software, just because they're not allowed to be as open about it.
This starts me off thinking about how we're talking about intuition and familiarity, so repetition and so on. Prolonged practice makes you an expert, and if you're a design expert, and when you've been working in all these different environments and different projects and design situations of the years, can you ever trust your intuition as a designer? In sense that thinking about, I think in the book you have the example of the fireman. It was a fireman in a building with a cellar they didn't know about. That was a wonderful story where the fireman trusted his intuition and saved his crew because there was things that were fishy about this fire he was dealing with. Without going into all the details, but there were unknowns that he didn't know about. But his spider sense basically picked up on these things, and
yeah, he thought he had ESP, extrasensory perception. Like he thought he had a supernatural power because he was in the situation where the fire seemed very dangerous and he couldn't put his thumb on what it was, but he trusted his gut and his, and got his crew out. But then when Gary Klein, the researcher, really pressed him to say like, okay, well, tell me more about the situation. He was like, yeah, the fire was too quiet and the fire was hotter than it should have been. And the fire wasn't reacting to the spray of our water in the way that it should have. And Gary's like, okay, so you it was actually your experience. Like these weren't matching your expectations, right? We were talking about like it doesn't match, and so you have a flight response, right? Like you're like, I got to get out of here. This isn't meeting my expectations, and therefore it's dangerous, right? Like sometimes that is not a great thing that humans have. That things that aren't as expected we perceive as dangerous. I think a lot of our social problems are kind of rooted in that. But in the sort of survival sense, like it is essentially what has allowed us to survive as a species. So it does have good implications in situations like that fire for that fireman. It's interesting because the fireman was kind of like, as he went through this, he was both Klein in his book talks about how he was both proud that it was actually his experience that saved his crew, but he also was like almost like worried because now he's like, wow, I thought I had this superpower and it would protect me, and now I realize I'm just like everyone else. So
but he does have a superpower.
He does.
This is how his experience.
Exactly.
And that's just fascinating that when you've got that I suppose that narrow specialism, because he was a fireman and he worked on dealing with fires, so it allows them to get that kind of not tunnel vision as such, but you've kind of really narrowed the world down so that these are the things I deal with. I can see what's off track, and my responses can build up from that. Whereas going back to what I was saying about us as digital designers, our world's massive and complex, and we're just constantly dealing with new problems, different problems. So even though we're specialist designers with huge amounts of experience, I just wonder whether we can actually ever really trust our intuition.
Yes.
Given the broad scope of what we work with.
It's a really good question to ask. And as designers, we need to constantly be checking our bias. But the good news is Klein, the researcher I was, who has that awesome psychic fireman story, and Gary Kahneman, who is, a Nobel Prize winning economist who spent his career studying bias. They actually collaborated on a paper that looked at when can expert bias be trusted. And so they have two very different takes on intuition and bias, like Kahneman calls it bias and Klein calls it intuition, and you can kind of guess which bias they have towards this, automated subconscious process that we have, just based on the names that they call it, but it's the same. It's just, two names for the same thing. And so, they are, they're creating, they've created these rules that say, okay, you can trust and rely on expert intuition when two things are true, and both have to be true: that there are rules that can be learned, and that that somebody has enough time and practice to learn the rules. Now, these rule sets can be extremely complicated, but there are rules, right? The reason the fireman could build expert intuition is because he's learning through, experience the laws of thermodynamics, right? Fire behaves a certain way because of the laws of thermodynamics. There are a ton of rules that guide it, and it's fairly finite number of rules. It is complex, don't get me wrong, right? Like it really is complex, but it is predictable enough that it can be learned through study. A lot of study, but through study. I would say that the rules of design, especially when it comes to things like how human attention works, right? Like, where is an eye drawn on a page, right? Like, those are rules that we can learn. We also are relying on a set of established normative patterns, right? Things like an accordion, right? It opens and closes. It works just like a drawer would in real life. Like, we're leaning on metaphors that, it should work like a drawer in that it opens and closes and reveals something. It's the same thing in the drawer every time, just like a physical drawer in your, I don't know about you guys, but I don't have any magical drawers in my house where I put something in it, I close it, and I open it back up, and it's something different.
My sock drawer.
Okay, fair enough. You got me.
We've got some hidden drawers.
But
we've got drawers hidden in our skirting boards in the kitchen. They're fantastic.
but like we have a set of fairly standard, an X in the corner of the page, right? And that is always going to close whatever you're doing, or it should always close. Otherwise, you're violating those expectations. And as a community, we are creating, and we're adding to it, right? Like the infamous hamburger menu, those like 3 horizontal lines that, Facebook started using to indicate a menu that people, think look like a hamburger. That now people have seen that enough, and we as a community have used that in a standard way enough that has become an intuitively recognized icon. It was not for years, right? Facebook put it out there, so it got lots of exposure, but it took a long time for it to really proliferate into the sort of intuitive use. But we can make new intuitive UIs, UI elements, new intuitive components through the proliferation throughout our community, which I think is really interesting. So I would say that to a certain extent, yes, we as designers, there are rules of design, and there's rules of human attention, and there are rules that we can learn in order to develop good intuition about, I'm going to look at this design, and I can predict to a relative certainty that is going to cause a lot of problems for a lot of people, right? Like, we've all had that experience, like, oh man, nobody's going to be able to find that. And, then if you put it up, like 9 times out of 10, you're right. Now, we're not always right when we try to predict future human behavior. That is actually one of the areas that both Kahneman and Klein agree is really difficult to do, to predict future human behavior. Because things like, it's really difficult to try to predict whether a criminal will reoffend, right? Because there's so many contributing factors to that around, like, if that person, like why that person would reoffend. Is it personal? Is it environment? It's just so complex. Things like trying to predict the stock market and try to outdo what, just kind of like the base of the stock market. It's really difficult to predict that, because it's such a complex set of rules and so much really complex human behavior. So if you're just trying to predict, 1 step out or 2 steps out, you can probably learn to relative certainty what the options are and help somebody and be able to develop good intuition about where those are going. But when you're trying to predict something like how well will a student do in college, 3 years from now, like you're getting outside of the realm of which, the system is predictable enough to be learnable. So
I think you've done this beautiful job of explaining how different it can be for different people, because you have these people with the expertise, and then you have the people with the serious familiarity. And I just have to say this, I had this aha moment when I was reading the book, because especially when you're thinking about the types of effects of stress, with tunnel vision, with your body shaking, difficulty reading and focusing, getting information overload. You have people who live with that constantly. And so it overlaps perfectly with how we do accessibility. So if you follow the advice in your book, I think you will support the needs of so many more people than just the people who are under stress, but actually the people who are living with under these conditions and have these difficulties every day.
Yeah, I mean, I think that in general, accessible design and inclusive design, tends to benefit everyone, because even people who aren't stressed, if you are simplifying your design enough so that it can be used by a stressed person, then it's simpler for everyone to use. So much of accessible design is like that. Things like closed caption, like it was originally created for the hearing impaired, but it's so useful for, everybody, like people who are in loud environments, or I was in the car the other day and my daughter was watching her iPad and I was like, can you just turn it off? Like, I don't want to hear it. And then so she could put on the closed caption and still enjoy her show, even though her mom didn't want to hear the noise in the car, right? Curb cuts in sidewalks, like these are things that were created for people in wheelchairs and with mobility issues, but it helps parents with strollers. It helps people who have a cart for their groceries. Like, it helps everybody. And so often when we create designs that are meant to help people in extremes, we end up helping everybody. And I think that's just, good accessible design.
That's so beautiful to end on. Thank you, Katie.
Yeah.
Thank you, Katie. So, at the very beginning of Katie's book, and we touched on aspects of this during the interview, but the three, I suppose, types or situations where products and stress appear or happen. One of them is products that are used in notoriously high stress situations or by people who have stressful jobs. The examples are day traders or some people doing certain types of customer service.
Pilots, maybe.
Yeah, I guess, yeah. But yeah, it's an acknowledged high stressful job. Answering emergency service calls, that kind of thing. I mean, clearly, if you do design work on those products, you're aware of the task of designing a product to be used in those situations. Your research and so on will clearly show these people they're experts in it. So maybe they're not in heightened stress in the same way as some other people will be with unexpected stress. But anyway, there's flags to tell you as a designer you're going to have to work with that. Then we have the products that are intended to be used in moments of high stress. So you're actively designing a product to be used by someone who isn't normally stressed, but that situation is stressful. And the examples like the one you gave or we talked about with the car crash or car incidents. You've just had an incident. You need to report it to
you need to report it, right?
Report it, or you need to get help from a repair service or pickup truck or whatever it is.
Yeah, just finding that number, because I've been in situations where I've just had to call someone, and finding the number is the hardest part.
Yeah, it used to be like I remember you used to have stickers on car windows that used to have the emergency numbers and so on. But so there again, you're a designer. When you get into that design job, you were aware of a scenario. The scenarios, situations are going to be stressful. And that's going to be an input into your design work. Then the third group or type of product is all of our products. Yeah. The ones that we don't think of them as products that would be stressful to use. They aren't fundamentally stressful products themselves, but nevertheless are being used by people while they are in a heightened state of stress. And I know what during that, we're talking about accessibility. We often use the example of maybe a parent with carrying a baby or a toddler in one arm, being a one-armed user, temporary disability. But if you're a parent and maybe you have to do something using an app on your mobile phone while you're carrying a screaming baby, that's stressful.
Exactly.
So you as a designer, you maybe don't initially, if you're stress testing, literally stress testing your products, you maybe wouldn't necessarily think about how your product might be used in a stressful situation, because there are just so many situations where it could be stressful, and you happen to be involved in that.
And that is so super interesting to me, because actually we had a conversation with Katie after the interview as well, as we sometimes do in these live interview situations. We were talking about, so in order to make, if we are aware that people can be stressed, we need to actually test that. But it would be unethical to actually bring someone in and make them stressed during usability testing.
Yeah.
Which makes it really hard to ensure that your product is working the way you want, unless you can actually get some of your colleagues to be the stressed people, and you have that consent situation. But it also made me think that within accessibility, we often talk about, well, if we always bring in and make sure to focus on people with accessibility challenges, then we will always cover in the widest possible, broadest base of users, which means that we should be bringing in people who are especially sensitive to distraction, to tonality, to language, and make sure that these people are the ones we're bringing in, because they can help us cover so many more issues that we perhaps couldn't anticipate.
And you brought up like pilots as a recognized high stress job. Then when designing in that industry, then normally you would have simulations. There would be, software would be tested in a more safe environment. That possibly also stimulates the stress, because in some of these flight simulators are really quite believable. But that isn't always the case for many other situations. I actually don't know when you're doing changes to I guess you test all software, don't you? But how you simulate the stress. So day traders, for example, how do you really simulate the stress of that job in a test environment? It's a real challenge getting people to come and be stressed. And Katie in the interview points out about how bad we are at predicting the future, or how bad we are at kind of simulating some of these things ourselves. So if talking back about things, so if you brought in someone who doesn't normally stress and you're interviewing them, they might well not give you, like the fireman, they had to dig there in a different way to get out the expert skill that made him understand what was fishy about the fire. But you still maybe have problems getting them to reveal all about how they would behave in a stressful situation.
You don't know. I think there's a Swedish movie that also remade into an English movie, where there's this father and this family on a ski trip, and there's an avalanche, and the father runs away from his family, and that's like the sort of plot point for the movie. Yeah. How could he do that? He didn't know what he would do in that situation, of course. Looks interesting.
And that would be, I suppose, a perfectly biological correct response for the situation, right. In a way, as in he fled. You might argue that another correct response would be to protect your clan, your flock.
Exactly.
But no, stress is difficult, and stress is complicated. The book has a lot of good tips and answers about what you can do. But my own reflections after talking to Katie and reading the book is that I don't think I'd really given stressed users enough thought and place in my design work, because a lot of the time, whenever I'm working with expert interfaces, then I've been very aware of it. Exactly like I said, when you know that you very much know that your user base is that person doing that job, customer service or whatever it is. But in the other times when you're doing stuff, e-commerce or whatever, general products, then no, I don't think I really consider it in the same way.
No, I agree, and that was a huge aha moment for me reading the book and talking to Katie. It's really, really useful, and I think this is one of those books that I'm going to be recommending to all designers. So what shows should people be listening to next, James?
Well, I think one that dovetails nicely into life and death design is Design for Safety with Eva Pentimug.
Yes.
We talked to back in episode 270. In that episode, we're talking more about interpersonal safety. So your safety as a human, rather than with life and death design, we're talking about mainly stress.
Yeah.
Good compliments.
Very good. Also one of those I recommend a lot for people to listen to. Remember to keep moving.
See you on the other side.
there are 2 muffins in an oven. And the first muffin turns to the second muffin and says, "Man, it's hot in here." And the second muffin looks at the first muffin and says, "Ah, a talking muffin!"